Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, sword enthusiast as well as fantasy adventurer. And with that in mind, you can probably understand that I'm always deeply interested if there is a new weapon that arises that could do its job better thanks to maybe a special design, a material that is made out of, a fantasy magical enchantment, or indeed an advanced science fiction technology, which brings us to the topic of this video, and that being vibroblades, as seen in Star Wars Expanded Universe canon, but now in the more mainstream canon thanks to its appearance in the Disney Plus series The Mandalorian. So to kick us off, I'm going to briefly describe what the vibroblade is according to Star Wars canon, main source being Wikipedia, and I'm going to see if there's any precedent for such a concept that could exist in the real world based on real-world technology, and then even expand it a bit to technology we haven't developed but might still be possible. And then, once we kind of lay that foundation, I want to see how effective it would be and if its use in Star Wars canon, main source being The Mandalorian, reflects how it would really operate if you could actually make a vibroblade in real life. Now, the reason why I'm going to be focusing on The Mandalorian, because yes, vibroblades appear in the Expanded Universe quite a lot. Unfortunately, the Expanded Universe canon was mostly decanonized, thanks to Disney, but also there's a general acceptance that anything outside the mainstream movies are generally not considered full proper canon yet. Originally, that was because George Lucas wanted to maintain control over the Skywalker continuity, but unfortunately Disney betrayed that completely because they didn't give a stuff about canon either in many instances of the sequel trilogy. But personally, for me, I don't even consider the sequel trilogy Star Wars canon. It's just really bad fan fiction made by a soulless corporation. But then why is The Mandalorian being considered or accepted more, even by myself, as more established canon in the Star Wars universe than, say, the sequel trilogy? And just to share a small opinion here, I think it's primarily because of respect it shows to pre-existing Star Wars continuity, both the continuity that exists in the, Star Wars mainstream movies, but also Star Wars lore that exists outside. And the vibroblade is a classic example of this. As I mentioned, vibroblades appear in the expanded Star Wars universe quite a lot. One of the first times I actually came upon vibroblades in the Star Wars universe was when I was playing Knights of the Old Republic, and vibro swords were one of the main weapons that you could get before you upgraded to lightsabers. And the Mandalorian series, instead of just ignoring or even contradicting pre-existing Star Wars lore and canon, it's actually been respecting it and incorporating it, which just has added more fun and enjoyment for fans of the Star Wars universe. And in contrast that to, say, the bad fan fiction sequels, well, they have shown tremendous disrespect to established Star Wars canon, like the characters, the utility of hyperspace in combat scenarios and stuff like that, and many other reasons. And obviously I'm not a fan. If you're a fan, all power to ya, but I think there is a very distinct reason why The Mandalorian is so popular at the moment. Okay, so what are vibroblades? According to Wikipedia, they are essentially a regular type of knife. Well, obviously it has a technological component somewhere in there, but there's a core blade, which is very similar to a regular knife, but it has an addition called, it's not supersonic, I think it's ultrasonic, an ultrasonic vibration generator. And according to its inscription, the ultrasonic vibration generator increases the cutting capacity of the knife or sword very considerably, but in actuality, it does a lot more than that, because it says with this effect, it can actually cut through things like Durasteel and even Beskar armor, which is crazy, because I would assume that most vibro blades, swords or knives, are made out of Durasteel, and usually, metal implements cannot, or at least have tremendous difficulty, cutting through objects of the same material hardness and strength, or metal of the same type. And Durasteel is pretty prominent in the world, and if vibroblades can cut through Durasteel, and they're made out of Durasteel, that means this ultrasonic vibration effect is actually increasing the strength and resistance of the blade itself. Now, if we were to try and figure out what this description is actually meaning, personally, I've come to two conclusions as to what it's actually describing. The first thing is that the blade itself is moving and vibrating, and what type of effect would that have on its cutting capacity? More than you might realize. You see, blades have an interesting property, is that even if they're really sharp, you're actually far less likely to cut yourself when you put pressure on the blade because it's actually not moving, okay? For a blade to cut, it needs to slide even a small amount along the surface of whatever it's coming into contact with. And of course, the material it's coming into contact with needs to be softer than the actual bladed instrument itself. And so even when you do a strike, if it's with a knife or let's take an example of a sword. Okay, so even if you do a flat strike that seems to have no movement at all, there is still microscopic movement on the impact which causes the cut. And then if you do a draw cut, actually draw it in, the cut is going to be far more effective. And so movement on the edge of any bladed instrument increases cutting capacity. Now, if the blade itself was vibrating really, really fast, that means it's going to create a sawing-like effect, but not exactly. In actual fact, it's more of a cutting-like effect because you need to understand a distinction between what a cut is and what a sawing motion is. A saw doesn't technically cut. It has tooths that scrape along the surface of material and gouges the material out. This is why when you saw and you actually get really stuck into it, material is getting removed as it continues to saw. So see all the sawdust flying off? Now, why does a saw need to operate that way? Well, for the simple fact that there needs to be enough room for the actual blade to pass through. If it didn't remove material, the blade would get stuck right in the material it's trying to cut through. The problem that swords have is that when they cut into something, they actually have to, instead of removing material, push the material apart to make room for the blade for it to cut through. And as a result, many swords can actually get stuck in the thing that you're trying to cut because of the friction that results as a natural byproduct. And so going back to vibro blades then, does the actual movement then increase cutting capacity? It still would, okay, but not to the point where it would be removing material, and because of that, unless you have a lot of momentum behind the strike, there is a chance that the blade will still get wedged in whatever you're cutting, and even if you have a lot of momentum, okay, material you're trying to cut into has a lot of resistance, okay, it's still going to get stuck. But that's not to say... got sawdust all over me now. It's not to say that it's going to be useless, because do we have, in the real world, a similar type of tool? And the answer is, we actually do. Electronic carving knives essentially operate on the exact same principle. And that is, well, with this one specifically, there are two blades that go like this, create a sawing motion, and as a result, they will naturally cut quite effectively, as I will show you right here. So, cuts through, very simple, very easily. Now, a vibro blade will essentially have this same effect, but enhanced to a much greater degree. In fact, these ultrasonic vibrations happen at an insanely fast rate, which could explain why it's called ultrasonic, because they could be moving much faster than the speed of light.
Yes, I said speed of light then. I obviously meant faster than the speed of sound.
But there's a bit more to this ultrasonic kind of utility or incorporation, which is that second possible interpretation of how vibro blades actually work. Because even with what I just did right here, there's a limitation in, electronic carving knives because it's still cutting. It's not sawing, technically. It's not removing material. So if I grab my block of wood again and try and cut through here, it gets stuck. It's not moving. It's still cutting, but it could not go any deeper than that. The blades were going really, really fast, but why wasn't it cutting any deeper? It's because it was getting wedged right in the edge of the wood. This is the real-world limitation that vibro blades would naturally fall into if they existed in the real world. Now, is there any other possible interpretation of how they function that could supersede or overcome this limitation? Perhaps. But the thing is, every enhancement that this blade receives from the, ultrasonic vibration generator does not take away the reality that this blade still has a certain amount of width. One of the ways to circumvent this is to make the blade really, really thin. But we've seen in both the expanded Star Wars stuff and the Mandalorian series itself that vibro blades aren't particularly thin. In actual fact, they're about as thick as a regular knife. Oh, and by the way, before I continue, I will put the caveat that if vibro blades can cut through Beskar, like Wikipedia says, they don't in The Mandalorian. We see them actually slash on, Beskar armor, and they don't really do a thing. So it could be that they either weren't being ramped up to the greatest strength that they could achieve, or it's only circumstantial. Like at certain angles, they have a chance to cut through, but in most instances, they won't. So this limitation I'm just explaining here is a physical limitation that would exist on any blade that has any amount of width. The way that you could reduce it is if there was, say, a type of technology that reduced friction on the sides of the blade, so even if, you know, there's a lot of pressure being pushed in, if there's actually less friction as a result, there's a much higher chance of the blade going through. And even blades that would essentially be indestructible and sharpened to a molecule, you know, edge would still have that limitation and would not be able to chop through particularly dense materials that would wedge it in. And this would apply just as much to, say, Wolverine's claws as a vibro blade. But this is not necessarily the only way to interpret how a vibro blade works, because there's another description in how vibroblades work on Wikipedia that is very odd. And it's that any cut made with a vibroblade actually ends up being far more devastating and bigger on the actual target, bigger than even the amount of blade contact it had with the target. Now that is interesting, because that implies something far more than mere vibrating at a supersonic speed. And at first I was thinking, you know, there's nothing really that would give that type of effect from the technology that they're describing. Now is the point in the video we're moving beyond, you know, real world technology to try and figure this part out. We actually need to think about things that could be possible, even if we can't technologically achieve them right now. So as I was thinking about it, I was wondering what could actually cause a bladed instrument to cut beyond the surface of its edge. And so if I just nick someone, it could still cut off an entire arm. That's essentially what they're saying vibroblades can do. And my first thought is, what about extremely fast and condensed and focused jets of air? Yes, they could actually cut, but that's an effect of air pressure, not sound, because this is particularly about vibration, but also speed. And is that speed referring to something moving faster than the speed of sound, or is it referring to an effect from sound waves? That was interesting. So I did a bit of digging, and I looked up to see if sound waves can cut. And remarkably, I found they can. It's under very extreme circumstances. The sound waves need to be really, really tight and dense and extremely focused, and they're well beyond the range of hearing that humans can detect. But in that extreme range, sound waves can cut. That's interesting. So there is about the limit of my understanding in the science of sound waves, and I have no idea if you could produce such heightened and focused sound waves from a vibrating material. Perhaps it's possible, I have no idea. But when I think about it, because we know vibration can create sound waves, but they're usually not nearly as focused as what they would need to be for sound waves to cut, and they would probably emanate all around the blade, not in a single straight line. Yet we are dealing with science fiction, and so this is the part where you can use the hand-wavy pseudoscience element of world building in a satisfying way, if it's founded on a vein of logic that you're kind of extrapolating on, especially if you're going into a realm where we honestly don't know. Could a technology like this exist? We don't know. And so therefore, if it's not explicitly contradicted or denied from our understanding of physics right now and technology right now, you can incorporate these things into fiction in a really satisfying way. The problem arises is when you make up stuff that outrightly does contradict things in the real world. You can kind of get away with it if it's in an area of knowledge that most people are unfamiliar with, and you can make up a pseudoscience explanation people will generally accept it. But if it's an area that most people already understand, say gravity, and you're contradicting laws of physics without a satisfactory explanation as to why, if it's a certain technology, if it's doing something, if you're just bullcrapping laws of physics, of course, normal people are going to see that and go, that doesn't make sense. In addition to this, if then you also contradict laws that exist or have been pre-established in canon, that can be just as unsatisfying and annoying to the audience as if you're just contradicting the laws of physics and someone starts flying for no reason at all. There's no magic, there's no force, they just fly, right? They fly now! Even without backpacks, okay? So the thing that I'm obviously referencing here is the Holdo maneuver. Now, going back to vibroblades, I don't know how sound waves are created from vibrations, but it doesn't seem illogical to try and hand wave and say that, okay, there is a type of field generated through this ultrasonic vibration generator, and, it could be an energy field or something like that, which focuses the sound waves that are produced from the vibrating blade that is vibrating at an insanely fast and, almost violent rate. It's just crazy fast, and is able to focus and project those sound waves in the two planes in which the blade is facing, which is x-axis, y-axis, but not the, z-axis. I'm probably messing that up, but you get what I'm saying, okay? It focuses the sound waves in one direction, and if it's single-edged, yes, and it wouldn't, focus on the back. And this could explain why sometimes single-edge vibroblades are preferred, because perhaps they can cut better because they focus the sound waves in a more efficient way instead of splitting it into two directions. So this could be really cool, because if that's the case, that means a vibroblade could cut through sound waves in the direction which the blade is facing at an actual distance from the blade. There would come a limit, a point where the vibrations become unfocused. Just like with sound waves, the more they travel, the more they dilute because they're expanding outwards. You could kind of do that in the same way. This is a possible explanation that has far more logical validity to explain a scientific basis for how vibroblades could possibly work and perhaps could exist if we develop the technology eventually to achieve it. The danger with doing this is that my explanation is not canon. This is just a fan filling in the gaps to try and think of what's a way in which these could really work. Because the problem with doing that is that if it's not canon, it can be outrightly contradicted in, future Star Wars creations or whatever. And it's already happened to me, okay? Because, case in point, crossguards on lightsabers. Obviously really, really useful. So why wasn't anyone ever doing it before Kylo Ren? Before the sequel trilogy, they simply didn't exist. And so there was a simple explanation to say it was a limitation in the technology. You couldn't split the lightsaber flows. I mentioned this in my review of how, the problems with lightsabers. So more detail in that video. Summarizing here is that you could explain it with a technological limitation, and that was satisfying for me. And okay, the lack of crossguards on lightsabers aren't a problem. Come the sequel trilogy around, crossguards on lightsabers. That just creates a massive plot hole now as to why wasn't anyone else doing it, because there wasn't mentioned that this is a special type of technology Kylo Ren developed. It's just, he just has it, okay? And no one else then catches on and makes their own. It's just, so it screws up my, fan theory explanation that I inserted into it, because nothing was set in stone as to why lightsabers didn't have crossguards. And this is the same as to why vibroblades could logically function according to their proper, how the technology could feasibly exist in the real world. Okay, let's now look at the most official canon representation of vibroblades, which is in The Mandalorian, and it seems to be the general, accepted standard that anything that appears in a live-action property of Star Wars that's official, it's a film or something like that, supersedes any other canon that exists in expanded trilogy or expanded universe or something like that, which is why if vibroblades operate differently in comic books or in the novels, stuff like that, different to how they're shown in the Mandalorian example, just by nature of this unspoken standard, seems to supersede any of those contradictions. And so now looking at how they operate in The Mandalorian, does this confirm, or do they operate in the way in which they naturally would if they were founded on the technological basis in which I was describing? Yes and no. There's a problem, okay? And it's that we do see a vibroblade stabbed to the hilt in a target, the mudhorn. And there is no greater cutting ratio from the point in which it's stabbed in, which seems to contradict this explanation of how vibroblades operate, because according to Wikipedia, they should have a much greater cutting ratio than the actual length of blade itself. There should actually be a much wider gash or cut. But is there an explanation? Because there is another big question mark that existed about that scene when I was watching it, and it's that the length of blade that the Mandalorian has, which is even smaller than this, would not be able to stab deep enough into such a large animal to kill it, okay? It only stabbed essentially into the surface fat of that thing, and it instantly killed it in the show, but if an animal like that actually existed, unless that it had a specific special insta-kill artery on its neck, you are not going to drop that thing by shoving a knife only that far into its neck. Unless the cutting ratio of the weapon could actually be extended further away from the blade. But we don't see that. The entry hole is only the length of the blade. But what if you could adjust the projection of these highly focused and intense sound waves, okay? And The Mandalorian, and look, this is me giving the most charitable interpretation in the world, because this is not explained in the show one bit. But what if, okay, the vibroblade is operating the exact way that I was saying, but the Mandalorian, knowing he needed to stab much deeper into this mudhorn to kill it, that he simply adjusted the angle or direction in which the sonic waves are being projected from the vibroblade, so that when it actually stabbed in, the sonic waves were being projected much further in, and it actually ended up stabbing about this deep into the mudhorn, which is a far more lethal penetration than just the length of the blade itself. That would explain it, okay? And it's very satisfactory. I think it's founded on a lot of good logic that makes sense, but it could be contradicted completely, because if we see, the Mandalorian in a situation where he needs to use the vibroblade now, and it only cuts within the range of the blade itself, this would be outrightly contradicting the Wikipedia, explanation that says vibroblades can cut in a much wider range than just the size or angle of the blade, okay? That you do a nick and it causes a really deep cut. That we would have a problem there. So send this video to people who work on Mandalorian and Star Wars to try and make it official canon that this is how vibroblades work, because if they don't catch on to this, there's a much higher chance that they'll just contradict it in later episodes, which would be very annoying. And that would then mean if vibroblades do not actually extend or shoot out a kind of cutting wave of energy through highly intense supersonic whatevers, that means that would essentially, the only other explanation of what a vibroblade is doing is that the blade is vibrating a lot. And I mean, in The Mandalorian, we see kind of a shadow outline of the vibroblade about that, so they might vibrate in a much wider range, but only about yay big around the blade. And that would only have the result of the vibration itself, which means it would operate very similar to an electric carving knife, and then would have the same limitation of the blade thickness. But hang on, would the blade thickness still be a limitation if it had this ultrasonic effect of, being able to cut much wider than its blade, size? Not necessarily, because if something is cut out here, it's much easier for something to be wedged apart if the wedging distance is really wide, okay? And so the material doesn't need to move apart that much, okay? The angle doesn't need to move that much to make, allowance for the blade to pass through, which means a vibroblade that's cutting in the way that we're kind of describing here, that cuts further away from the blade itself, has a much higher chance to wedge apart material and cut through than if it was forcing things to be wedged apart much closer to the blade. That could result just from the vibration thing. And so even, this problem is lessened by this more, science fiction hand-wavy example. But like I said, I think it's based on logic of vibroblade technology. So it's a very interesting subject. And as you've seen, we've been able to kind of explore different theories, different elements of physics and principles of weapon technology, so you can see why I find it really interesting. But if that is the case, that is really cool. Now, this video is already pretty lengthy, but have you seen any of my other videos on Shadiversity? Because there is one other subject I wanted to discuss in regards to vibroblade, and that is the matter of knife versus sword. Because if vibroblades, let's say, yes, they are just as effective in the most charitable way I've explained in this video, with the vibration effect happening much wider, why then is the Mandalorian not using a vibrobladed sword instead of a vibrobladed knife? This is actually not that hard of a question to answer, because the same reason, I think the answer comes in the same or similar ways in which it happened historically. Why didn't everyone carry a sword historically? Because sometimes a knife does the job, and it's a lot more convenient, okay? And with the Mandalorian, his main weapon is always, or should always be, his guns, okay? And sometimes he chooses, bafflingly, to resort to his other weapons and not his most effective weapon. All right, so plot hole, right? But vibroblades do exist in the Star Wars universe, so why would you use a vibro sword over knives? Well, it comes with, shielding technology. Wikipedia and other sources I found says that vibroblades are able to pierce shielding much easier, sometimes like it's not even there, in comparison to blaster fire, and that would explain it very, very neatly. But personal shielding is not something we have seen in the Star Wars universe.
Sorry, I meant to say the Star Wars films and TV shows.
At all, apart from particular droids. But not on people. So that doesn't answer that either. Sometimes it's to combat lightsabers. If you're fighting a Jedi who can deflect all your blaster fire and nullifies your range capacity completely, well, would you do better at fighting them melee? Usually not because of the Jedi's superhuman abilities, but if a Mandalorian has the armor and is particularly well trained and his blaster fire is being nullified, okay, could he use a vibroblade? In some instances, because as to if a lightsaber can chop through a vibroblade, it depends, and it depends on the Star Wars, whatever you're looking at. In Knights of the Old Republic, they couldn't. There was some type of energy field that blocked lightsabers from vibroblades. In other expanded works, like in comics, lightsabers can chop through vibroblades unless they're made out of a special material that's very rare and was mostly forgotten by when the main trilogy comes about. So if you had a vibroblade that could block lightsabers, okay, a vibro sword could be a very logical option to use in such a situation. But there are other situations in which a vibro sword would be preferable over a vibro knife, in my opinion, and that's if you are needing to do far greater damage, like with the Mandalorian versus the Mudhorn. It looked like his regular blaster fire wasn't able to do enough damage, and he lost his main, pulse Canon, whatever thing that was called, his disintegration rifle, and the flamethrower just seemed to pee it off. And so, okay, resorting to a bladed instrument might be a perfect situation in which you could use it. And in that situation, a vibro sword would be far more effective than a vibroblade, because think of this, okay? If the ultrasonic vibration technology enhances the cutting ratio significantly from a knife, imagine how much more it would with a blade, okay? It would increase at the same percentage ratio, but because the blade is already so much bigger, the ultimate result could be cuts that might be able to chop an X-Wing in half, or something like that. That would be flippin' awesome to see. And what's interesting about this, if this is the way vibroblades work, they have a unique and profound effect that's even greater than lightsabers. We have not seen lightsabers be able to cut anything beyond the length of their saber, the beam itself. They are limited to their core range, just like a real sword. But if vibroblades can actually cut things at a distance, okay, that would be crazy. I might be extrapolating too far here, because the examples usually say you need to make contact with the vibroblade, and as soon as you make contact, then the cut is much greater. And so it still works with the Mandalorian stabby thing if you focus the things in, because he made contact, and that can send the ultrasonic vibrations to cut much deeper, but it needs that contact to work. It's kind of a cool limitation. So, all right, then that means you wouldn't have greater range than the range of the thing, but your cutting capacity would be greater. Even with me not being as generous as I was before, and you have to make contact to cut, its cutting ratio would still be vastly greater than that of a lightsaber, where you nick, an X-Wing and still cut it in half. That's a crazy advantage. And if vibroblades worked like that in real life, and if I was in Star Wars, I would actually pick a vibro sword over a lightsaber, if I could defend against lightsabers, and perhaps block lightsaber bolts and stuff. Is that my hot take? I think that's my conclusion. If vibroblades work the way that they are implied to, and based on this, technological mumbo-jumbo we've been talking about, in my opinion, they would be more devastating and have greater damage potential than that of a lightsaber, unless you wanted to melt a blaster door. Then you might run into some trouble. But there we go. And just because I like to, I'm going to do one last Jedi-style flourish. Because it's cool. Do I do the samurai way of putting it back? Right. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. I hope you have enjoyed. This was a really fun subject to cover. There was a lot of meat to kind of dive into. But share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really interested in hearing your kind of interpretational thoughts on this theory I have shared. I look forward to reading them. And of course, I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Shadiversity. So until that time, farewell.